Okay, well, I guess we can begin. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to today's debate featuring Dr. Yoram Hazony and Dr. Aurelian Craiutu on the question, is nationalism a virtue? My name's Dr. Stephen McGuire. I'm the acting director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center here at Villanova University. The Ryan Center exists to promote free and open inquiry into the principles and practices of a free society. This debate is part of a debate series that we're running this year, tackling important issues of contemporary relevance, but from a deep scholarly perspective, and also highlighting how people who disagree can nevertheless come together and have a respectful debate and still shake hands afterwards. The debate series is being sponsored this year by the Jack Miller Center, and this afternoon's debate is also being sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies and the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation. So we're very grateful for their support. As far as, before I introduce the speakers, as far as the format of this afternoon's debate goes, after this brief introduction, we'll have 3 questions that have been given to the speakers in advance, and they will take turns answering those questions, after which we will open things up for Q&A from the audience. At that point, we have a microphone down here to my left, to your right. We ask that anyone who'd like to ask a question come down and sort of line up along the wall here and then speak into the microphone to ask your question. And I'll remind you of that when we get to the Q&A session. And then at the very end, we'll allow each speaker 5 minutes for closing remarks. To my right is Dr. Yoram Hazony. Dr. Hazony is president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem and chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which this past summer organized a conference on national conservatism, and they're planning to organize one for this coming summer as well. Most recently, Dr. Hazony is the author of the book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which won the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's Conservative Book of the Year award and has been widely reviewed in academic circles, in the media, etc. He's the author of several other books, including The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture and The Jewish State, The Struggle for Israel's Soul. Our other speaker this afternoon is Dr. Aurelian Craiutu, who is professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is the author, most recently, of Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in an Age of Extremes, and he has a long record of publications, edited and otherwise, on especially French political thought. He holds his PhD from Princeton University and is a native of Romania. So we're very grateful to have these 2 speakers with us here this afternoon. And thank you again to all of you for coming. And I will begin by asking the first question and then turn things over first to Dr. Hazony and then to Dr. Craiutu. The first question is, why are we experiencing a revival of nationalism in Europe and America?
Well, first, thank you, Steve, and thank you for all the people who were involved in setting up this splendid discussion. There's no more important topic, and I'm really pleased to be at Villanova to discuss it. The question was, why are we experiencing a revival of nationalism in Europe and America? And I think the easiest way to think about this is to go back to 1989, to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what were the expectations at the time? I mean, not everybody here is going to remember them, but let me try to describe it to you. The Americans and their allies had been fighting a Cold War against the Soviet Union and against communism. And prior to that, a world war against Nazism and Japanese fascism. Three empires which had conquered significant parts of the world. And America positioned itself throughout these conflicts. We're talking about a half a century of conflict in which America positioned itself as the champion of a world of independent nations. Really what we could we could say, in a sense, the champion of the Westphalian order going back to 1648, but you could actually say going back further than that. The theory that the world is governed best when it's divided up among different nations, and that those nations are allowed to be free. They're allowed each one to pursue its own destiny, to cultivate its own traditions, to seek out its own interests according to its own lights. That was the fundamental theory of Western political order that America stood for. And during those long decades of conflict, where it was taken quite seriously, the possibility that the world could fall under absolutist tyranny and darkness, during those decades, the promise that Americans and their allies made repeatedly to, for example, the captive nations of Europe, was that America stood on the side not of one of these world empires seeking to conquer for itself, but rather that America stood for the freedom of nations. That if America won, then what it would do is it would assist the freeing of nations and allowing their self-determination. Now, when the Berlin Wall fell, something extremely strange happened, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more this evening. What happened was that there was a faction in the United States. Think conservative thinkers like Irving Kristol, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who argued that the war is over. The decades of struggle are over, and it's time to go to bring the boys home. It's time to take care of America. But that's not the direction that the Western world went. In fact, what happened is that Americans and Europeans alike switched gears and started to think in terms of what George H.W. Bush called a new world order. Right? By 2000, 2001, you're already hearing the American administration talking about a new world order. President Bush said that after 100 generations of mankind striving to achieve this goal, now it was going to be achieved. What's the goal? He said, we're going to replace the rule of the jungle the law of the jungle with the law of nations. In other words, we're going to wrap the entire world in a single regime of law that America is going to enforce. I have to tell you, when I heard this, I first heard this on the radio, I remember where I was standing, a chill went down my spine, and I said, I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. I can't believe that after 50 years of struggle, the Americans are now going to turn towards trying to impose an order on the world. The Europeans, they had their own view of this order. They had a dream of eliminating all the borders in Europe, the European Union. In 1992, they signed a treaty for the elimination of borders in Europe, and essentially what they call an ever closer union. That is a progressive move to eliminate the independent nations of Europe and to create a federal Europe or united Europe. Now, both of these two projects are what I would call imperial projects. Right? They're projects in which somebody in Washington or in Berlin or in Brussels or at the UN is going to decide what the rules are. And you've heard a lot during these 30 years about the rules-based international order or liberal internationalism. Now, the whole idea of nationalism is that there isn't going to be a rules-based international order, that nations are like children, and if they stray too far to this direction or that direction, and the Americans or the Germans decide they don't like it, then they start bombing operations until you go back, your country gets back into shape. But for 30 years, that's the kind of order that was, in fact, created. Invasions and bombing operations and replacement of regimes, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, Panama. I mean, the idea was this kind of, we Americans and Europeans, we just know the truth. We know the truth about how the world should be, and if people don't like it, they better fall into line. Play by the rules, Madeleine Albright said. Now, this attitude of, it has all sorts of good motives. You hear the advocates of this kind of a world order imposed from America and Europe. You hear them talking about the peace it's going to bring, the prosperity it's going to bring, the human rights it's going to bring. All the motives are good. I mean, the heart sings to hear, about all the peace and prosperity that's supposed to come from this world order. But the reality isn't anything like that, and it was never going to be anything like that. This was a utopian fantasy. The reality was that different countries have different perspectives. I'm not saying that they're not capable of evil. Of course they're capable of evil. But there actually is something of an argument among nations about what exactly constitutes evil. And even when there isn't an argument, how good are the Americans and the Europeans at replacing governments and turning them into better governments? Conservatives are used to saying, you can't centrally plan things. You have to allow locally for cultures to develop and for centuries to go by until people are ready for a certain kind of limited government or representative government or individual liberties. All of these things are things that are desirable, but they can't be achieved through bombing. And guess what? They can't even be achieved through invasion. The rise of nationalism throughout the world today, from Brexit in the UK to Donald Trump in the United States, to Orban and other nationalist governments in Eastern Europe, Salvini in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, and you can go on and on. Every democratic country in the world today is experiencing a nationalist revival. And the cause of this nationalist revival is, in my view, the arrogance and the condescension and the utopianism of Americans and Europeans who think that they can Americans think that they can invade Iraq and try to establish a democratic government there by force. Germans think that there's nothing wrong with them vetoing the Italian people's chosen finance minister and replacing him with a finance minister of their own, or vetoing the Italian budget or the Greek government. This is an extraordinary thing. You can't have democracy if you elect a people, you elect a government, you support a government, and then outside governments decide, well, we don't like that government, we're going to replace it. Essentially, the nationalist impulse is an impulse that we've known for thousands of years. People would prefer to be ruled according to their own customs, according to their own lights. They'd prefer to be ruled by one of their own. And the fact that we can sometimes look at a country and say, what a terrible government they have. We really think that's a terrible government. We might be right about that. We might also be wrong, but we might be right about that. That doesn't mean that the use of force to replace that government is going to cause something better. American intervention in the Middle East, hard to know. My guess is that the number of people who've died because of American intervention in the Middle East in the last 30 years is over 1 million people. No democracies were established. Nothing good came out of it, not for America, not for anybody else. Now, of course, people will say, it wasn't done properly. But you see, that's always the problem, isn't it? It's never done properly. And the best thing is to allow nations to rule themselves. If they succeed, good for them. Maybe we can learn from them. If they fail, it's mostly their problem. It doesn't mean we can't lend them a helping hand, but it's mostly their problem. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, so thank you for spending time on an important topic. I'd like to start with an event that we commemorated 5 days ago on November 9th. 30 years ago in Berlin, the wall fell. It was a momentous event. Within hours, literally within hours, without everyone having predicted it, it became clear that what happened in Berlin would have major repercussions without the world. We haven't noticed it too much in the United States last week, but it was a momentous event of our history and we should not forget it. Communism was relegated to the dustbin of history, and it is over. Now, we had illusions in 1989. In 1989, we believed that the world would be a flat world, finally. Some even resonated with the illusion described by John Lennon's famous song, "Imagine there is no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too." Remember that song? Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one, and I hope one day you'll join us and the world will be as one. That's what we were hoping for in 1989. We witnessed the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, and we hoped that would be the end of history. Well, it turned out to be differently. We discovered soon that the first decades of the 21st centuries were differently. Globalism has failed indeed to replace nationalism because it could not offer a political agenda that meets most the basic needs of individuals, the desire to be autonomous, the desire to be self-governing, the desire to be treated with dignity and justice. What we have today is the world described in the novels of the French novelist Michel Houellebecq. We have a distinctive malaise of our age, and a world characterized by alienation, loneliness, bowling alone, hollowing out of the political community and weakening of the states. More importantly, I would say the buzzwords of the 20th century, small government, neutral public sphere, free market, free trade, free movement, are in the process of being challenged and perhaps even replaced by national affiliations, economic nationalism, and a rediscovery of new forms of social responsibility. The collapse of communism in 1989 and 1991 evoked powerful national aspirations as well. National feelings were provoked and people responded. We were reminded once again of a famous line in the works of a French political theorist by the name Joseph de Maistre. De Maistre said in the 18th century, late 18th century, I've seen him many times, Frenchmen, Italian and Russians. I've even known, due to Montesquieu, that one may be a Persian, but as for man, with capital M, I have never met him in my life. If he exists, it is without my knowledge. Suddenly we discovered that there were in the world Latvians, Ukrainians, Romanians, Hungarians, Slavs of all kinds. We discovered again the importance of the need to belong. Now, this need to belong took two forms under the guise of nationalism. The first, I think, can be found in the wealthy regions of Europe, those that were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Regions such as Lombardy, northern Italy, Catalonia in Spain, Flanders in Belgium, and Scotland. This type of nationalism, the nationalism of the affluent, I would call, represents the desire of national groups in distinct territories to exercise the right to self-govern themselves. This type of nationalism, the nationalism of the affluent, is somewhat inwardly inclusive. It includes everyone who is within the community, but separatist and challenges the boundaries of the existing states in Spain, in Belgium, in Italy, and in the United Kingdom. More affluent regions, such as these ones that I mentioned, want to be freed from the obligations to share in the wealth with the other less affluent regions in their countries, the vulnerable regions. And then there is the nationalism of the vulnerable. This is a nationalism that is to be found on the other side of the continent, I mean Europe, but in other parts of the world. It is a legitimate revolt in many ways, legitimate revolt against the betrayal of the global elites, and also a search, a genuine search, sometimes an artificial one at other times, for rebuilding civic bridges. And this shows the erosion of civic solidarity and deeper social gaps within our societies. Both forms of nationalism are at work in the post-1989 world. We have lost, in other words, the sense of we. We live in fractured republics. We live like strangers in more than a community of citizens sharing meaningful social bonds. Now, Yoram Hazony thinks rightly, partly, that some of the ideas that we had are responsible for our current predicament. I think that the most momentous development of our era is the waning of the nation state, and we can claim that this is a good thing or a bad thing depending on which part of the aisle we sit. Its inability to withstand the 21st century's forces. States are in the process of sheer decline. It feels almost like the end of a world. That's why I think a strange type of apocalyptic nationalism has been in vogue lately in various parts of the world. Nation states appear to engaged spectators as being in an advanced state of political and moral decay, from which they can hardly extricate themselves. Now, why is this happening? And this is the question that was asked us to reflect upon. I think that the answer is pretty clear. 20th century political structures were in place to allow states to redistribute wealth, to allow citizens to live together under the umbrella of some form of civic solidarity. The 21st century institutions are those of deregulated finance, autonomous technology, artificial intelligence, and some form of great power rivalry that is developing in our centuries. As a result, there is a kind of mismatch between the institutions of the 20th century and the institutions and the forces at work in the 21st century. The states have lost control over the money flows. At the most obvious level, money is being transferred out of the national space altogether into various offshore accounts, offshore zones. And as a result, these fleeing trillions, there are many trillions that are fleeing, and they are going to undermine in many ways the capacity of the states to redistribute wealth and to give people a response, a meaningful answer to their search for roots. So to make a long story short, I think that we are witnessing a moment, a unique moment in history in which we are looking for new political forms capable of operating on the world scale. What these forms are is an open question for the discussion, but the stakes could not be higher. So it is easy to see why many Western governments are desperate to prove what basically everyone sees, that they are still in control. They are no longer in control, and the forces at work will make it even more difficult for them to be in control.
Great, thank you very much. So the second question is, should we fear the rise of nationalism, or should we embrace nationalism, and if so, in what form? And for this round, we will begin with Dr. Craiutu.
We must acknowledge that nationalism is a deceptive and complex ideology that can be pulled into different directions. At its worst, it can be a devastating and destructive power. At its best, it can be a modernizing force, a forward-looking and constructive power, integral to modernity and its progress. What are the benefits of nationalism? One would say, in its prime, nationalism was acting as a great equalizer. It erased the difference between high and low straight-edge society. It created a unified language. It created an inclusive public sphere and made people feel closer one another. It created a cross-class coalition in many countries, and nationality granted status, dignity, and ensured also economic rights as well. Welfare states were national states when they were created. Nationalism, properly understood, and I emphasize this, is an expression of the need for roots. But the need for roots, vital as it may be, must be complemented by other. And here I'd like to remind you of the pathologies of nationalism. The nationalism can take dangerous forms, no one can doubt. Here is an example of such pathological forms. George Orwell, writing in one of his essays, as I write, he mentions, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual, nor I against them. They're only doing their duty, as the saying goes. Most of them, I have no doubt, are kind-hearted, law-abiding men who would never dream of committing murder in private life. On the other hand, if one of them succeeds in blowing me to pieces with a well-placed bomb, he will never sleep any worse for it. He is serving the country which has the power to absolve him from evil. This is the negative balance sheet of nationalism. So I'm trying to suggest here that we may want to acknowledge the importance of nationalism here, but we need to work with the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. The language of patriotism has been used in past by many authors, and the most important definition of patriotism that I would love to offer tonight here for your consideration is the love of the republic, love of the country. The country defined as Cicero defined it in On Duties, an association of free and equal citizens who live under the empire of free laws and just laws and work with their consent to promote the common good. The language of patriotism is old. The language of nationalism is younger. It was forged only later, in late 80s, beginning 19th century, in Europe, to defend and reinforce cultural, linguistic, and ethnic homogeneity of a people. The person who coined the term was Johann Herder, for whom nationalism was inseparable from being rooted in a particular national culture, from being protected against cosmopolitanism and cultural assimilation, or, even worse, contamination. Nationalism denoted a little world which contains within itself a center of happiness, the nation as a little world which contains within itself the center of gravity and happiness. Now, patriotism, as I try to suggest, is something different, and we may be able to work with it. Patriotism should not be assimilated always with the affection that one has for one place of birth. True love of country, amore della patria, as the Italians say, is a passion generated by common liberty, the consequences of the wisdom of the laws and the institutions that make possible a free way of life. It is sustained by political participation in the administration of the affairs of our community. The crucial distinction between patriotism and nationalism, as I see it, lies in the priority of, or the emphasis. For those in the Republican tradition that stretches as back as Cicero in the Republican Rome, the primary value is the republic, the res publica, and the free way of life possible only in such a community. For the nationalists, the primary values are the spiritual and the cultural unity and homogeneity of a people. The love of country in the Republican tradition implies charity and compassion, animated by the perception of the fragility of the object of our love. That is the object that needs nurturing. The love in the nationalist tradition implies admiration and commitment to the greatness and glory of one's country, the desire to be free and independent. These are, in my view, two distinct ways of loving one's country, sometimes compatible, most of the time in tension with one another. So I think that it is possible for us to reconstruct a language of patriotism, love of country, as a patriotism of liberty and a free way of life, and a patriotism of compassion and caritas. One based on a love that does not come from excitement and admiration for the greatness of one's country. A patriot should not necessarily say, make the country great again, but from the perception of its weakness and the fragility, and the commitment to work to make sure that the free way of life that keeps us together will not vanish one day. These are two distinct ways of loving. A patriotism of compassion allows us to keep our eyes fixed on our country's achievements without diminishing the problems that we are facing. It can serve, in my view, as a powerful antidote to the nationalist love of country that is sometimes dangerously exclusive and has no appreciation for the fragility of the country. So this is a form of patriotism that is suitable, in my view, to individuals living in modern society. As the French political theorist Benjamin Constant said in a famous speech that was given exactly 200 years ago, in December 2nd, 1819, we are modern individuals. We are individuals that are interested in peace, commerce, in trading with us, and there's all the type of commitment from generosity, passion, ardor that is difficult to replicate today. I'm not saying that the second one is incompatible with the first one. I'm just saying that for us, individuals living in modern society, we can espouse a form of patriotism that is linked to self-interest, a patriotism that is linked to this tradition of Republican amore della patria. Thank you.
Well, look, anytime somebody comes to you and says, it's the Romans who I want to aspire to, and they have the superior way of governing the world, I think that you should at least pause and think. Now, I don't deny that there are beautiful and important contributions to be made by the Republican tradition of patriotism. that Aurelian Craiutu is referring to. In fact, I believe that we would probably agree on much of it, but that would be boring. So let's focus on a little bit on the part that we disagree about. Cicero's view of a universal value system is typically Roman, right? The universal reason gives you the natural law which governs the entire world. Now that's fine. I mean, the Bible has such a natural law also, but it's in the Bible, it's God who knows the natural law. It's not Cicero who knows the natural law. The Ciceronian conceit is that he and we can know the one law that's appropriate for all nations, and he lives in a republic which, despite all the greatness that you can ascribe to republican virtues, ultimately that republic exists in order to conquer other nations. That republic is a conquering machine, and Cicero and his colleagues are the lords over a conquering machine. Is it possible to have some kind of love of country that does not involve believing that your views are universal and seeking to impose them on the entire world? That's what we're seeking. That's what Herder was seeking. Herder is quoted here as though he invented the term nationalism. Maybe he invented the term nationalism, but Herder was referring to Hebrew scripture. Herder was referring to the kind of country that you find in the Bible. In fact, the Old Testament is for 16th and 17th and 18th and 19th century nationalists. The Old Testament is very often, especially in English-speaking countries, for the Dutch, for the French, for the Swiss, for the Scots, and for the Americans. It's the Bible that's the model, not the Roman Empire. How can you turn to the Roman Empire and say, that's going to be my model of patriotism? That's a patriotism of endless conquest. No, we're looking for something much more humble. We're looking for something much more moderate. And Professor Craiutu is an expert on moderation. On this we agree. We seek the same thing. Where does the moderation come from? I argue that the moderation comes from a view such as you find in Hebrew scripture. What kind of a view is that? That's a view that says, well, God, creator of heaven and earth, selected Moses, and he calls him, and he says, get out of your homeland, come to the land that I will show you, and what? V'escha legoy gadol. V'escha legoy gadol. I will make of you a great nation. Okay, God separates Abraham out. He says, I will make of you a great nation. V'nivachu v'cha kol mishpachot adama. And in you all the nations of the world will be blessed. So there is a universal aspiration. There is a universal aspiration from the very beginning. But Abraham is only given a small piece of land. What does it mean to say, I will make of you a great nation? It means I'm going to make of you an influential nation, a big nation, a successful nation. But notice that the word nation means one nation out of many nations. God doesn't say what the Romans said, or the Babylonians, or the Assyrians. God doesn't say, I choose you, Abraham, to conquer the four corners of the earth, to bring the earth to peace. It's not Abraham's job to bring the earth to peace. God talks to Moses, and he gives Moses borders. The Jewish people in the Bible are the first people, as far as we know, in human history to receive borders from their own God. God says, here are the borders, you will not cross them. If you cross them, you'll be punished. Where does the idea of a border come from? Today, borders are so difficult for us to understand. It comes from Scripture. It comes from this idea, this theological revolution which took place with the Hebrew Bible, when God, creator of heaven and earth, could have said, like all the other gods, go out and conquer the world and bring peace and prosperity. And instead he says, no, you, Moses, you think you know the universal truth. I gave you the truth for all mankind, but you are going to stay behind your borders. Why? Because we're told that the other peoples are given their lands by God as well. Right? That is the heart of a tolerant and tolerable international order. The beginning of civilization is not with Cicero. The beginning with civilization is with the drawing of the borders by the Hebrew God, who says good borders will make good neighbors. You don't have borders, and Cicero won't know where his republicanism stops. Professor Craiutu spoke eloquently and correctly about the challenges of the national state today. Let me bring in a thinker that I think is probably more important to this discussion than any other, and that's John Stuart Mill. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, the great empiricist, said that political science would have to be refounded, political theory would have to be refounded. Why? Because he said that the Enlightenment political theory that he had inherited is based on this kind of universal reasoning, this thinking in abstract terms that are supposed to apply to all mankind. He says there's no way to actually reach conclusions in this way. There's no way to know what is self-evident and then from that to deduce universal principles. What we need is to actually look at the world. We need to do, for example, what Montesquieu did or what Burke did when they were writing political theory, which is to look empirically at the way that the world is organized, at what actually works. We need to know what actually works. Mill writes about a quality called cohesion. National cohesion. It's the capacity of a people to maintain a mutual loyalty such that when they're put under pressure internally or externally, they're capable of surviving it. A nation that has cohesion is a nation that's going to survive through time. A nation that doesn't have cohesion is one that's going to fall apart. It's going to cease to exist. Right? And as Professor Craiutu said, all of our freedoms and our democracy and everything that we think is good about the societies we live in depends ultimately on being able to hold the country together and therefore on this cohesion. More about that in a moment.
Okay, thank you. So the mention of John Stuart Mill, one of the great liberal political theorists, provides a nice segue to our third question, which is, if we embrace nationalism, must we reject the liberal political tradition? Why or why not? Dr. Hazony.
Well, there's great confusion about what the word liberal means. So there are people who use the word liberal to say if you're a liberal, you're in favor of freedom. So I'm in favor of freedom. The Bible's in favor of freedom. Even the Romans claim to be in favor of freedom. So I think it's not a very useful tool to use the word liberal in that extremely broad sense. I think it's very confusing. So I'm going to use the word liberal in a much more specific way. Liberalism, I'll define liberalism in the following way. It's an Enlightenment political theory, a rationalist political theory that seeks to reduce politics, all of political life, and our understanding of it, to the free and equal individual taking on political obligations on the basis of consent. Okay, so in other words, free and equal individual consenting to enter into a society, a family, a clan, a tribe, a nation, and through consent, he or she takes on moral obligation. This is the basis of the political thought of many thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau's social contract, Kant, and it completely dominates political theory in contemporary American politics departments, for example. This kind of liberalism, right? If this is what you mean by liberalism, then I would say that there actually is a terrible difficulty in reconciling that with nationalism. Why? Because as I was just saying, I believe Mill is correct in looking at political society and saying the first thing we need to understand is what makes it cohesive, what binds it together. Look at the United States today. It used to have cohesion, but now it doesn't have cohesion. That's the reason that people are talking about resistance and civil war, God forbid. The reason people are talking about these terrible things today is because you can look around and see that the cohesion is frayed, the cohesion is being lost. The number one question in any political community has to, before anything else, has to be, what is it that causes the cohesion, and how do you lose it, and how do you get it back? Can you possibly get it back? Now here we have a problem. We have a problem because liberalism, as I've described it, Right? Liberalism is a theory that claims, it teaches everyone, you go to high school, you learn this. You go to college, you learn this. You go to graduate school, you learn it again. It teaches everyone that what holds a society together is consent. The free and equal individual consenting. Now, consent is important. Consent is very real. It's important in all sorts of things. It's especially important in businesses. It's especially important in getting married. But what holds a society together is not consent. It's something completely different, which liberal political theory doesn't touch on. In my book, I call it mutual loyalty. It's the sense that you and I, well, let's begin with me and my wife. It's the sense that me and my wife, who came all the way from Israel to sit in the audience today, it's the sense that my wife and I are one. I mean, this is a natural feeling that human beings have. The feeling that if something happens to my wife, if she gets hurt, it hurts me. It's not as if it hurts me, it really hurts me. And if something hurts me, then it hurts her. Now that's a reality, that's the fundamental bedrock reality of all of human politics, is that not only that human beings are capable of this, but they do it all the time. Human beings naturally, by nature, automatically, you don't have to teach it to them, they stick into these clusters of people who feel for one another. Families, and then families gather together in clusters of families, which are called clans, and those cluster into tribes, and those cluster into nations. And there's also clusters of nations when we speak about the Western nations or the the English-speaking nations. This reality has been completely eliminated from political thought by liberalism. We're not educated about it. The moment I start speaking about it, somebody, and it's probably running around through some people's minds already, people start to say to me, oh, you're a collectivist. That's fascism. That's organicism. Well, first of all, the name calling isn't going to help. Because if this is a psychological reality, then it just doesn't make any difference what names you call me. If you're ignoring it and it's reality, then you're not going to understand the political world. Calling me names isn't going to help. But second, notice I'm not saying that the family or the tribe or the nation must be put ahead of the individual. I'm not saying collectivism instead of individualism. That's a false dichotomy that liberals invented. The reality is that all human beings, most of the time, live for the people with whom they feel a mutual loyalty. In other words, if I need to take a job that I don't want to do, that makes me suffer in order to, because I'm loyal to my family, I'll do it. Right? Likewise, if I need to pay taxes, I live in a socialist country, I can assure you I pay more taxes than you can even imagine, and I suffer immensely doing it, but I pay them. I pay them. I pay them exactly as I'm supposed to. Out of what? Out of loyalty, nothing else. Otherwise, I would just say resistance. Boston Tea Party. But out of loyalty, I pay my taxes. Out of loyalty, I serve in the military, even if I have suspicions that the government doesn't have the right policy. I don't agree with their policy. Still, I serve in the military. In other words, it's mutual loyalty that makes it possible to do difficult things as a group. That's the way that most individuals, maybe not all, but that's the way that most individuals actually get meaning out of life. Purpose out of life is by being a part of a group with which they have mutual loyalty. Now, nationalism is about focusing on this mutual loyalty and placing it at the center. Liberalism is about ignoring this mutual loyalty and pretending it doesn't exist. Right? And that's the reason that today, in today's world, liberals and nationalists are two opposed camps. Because the nationalists are saying, this country should have borders. And the liberals are saying, what are you talking about? What does a border have to do with free and individuals living according to consent? And the nationalists say, the government of our country should protect our industry if necessary. And the liberals say, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with the free and equal individual living according to consent? In other words, A nationalist is capable of being a capitalist. A nationalist is capable of being a liberal. A nationalist is capable of recognizing freedoms. It doesn't happen in every place, but it often does. Out of loyalty to his country, he'll grant liberties and he'll support them. But a liberal is incapable of understanding why there should be nations. And calling for patriotism doesn't help if you don't recognize the actual mutual loyalties that actually bind a real nation together. You can't just be, call for patriotism to absolutely anything. You can call for patriotism of the European Union for another 5 centuries, and almost no one is going to be patriotic to the European Union because there are no actual ties of mutual loyalty that bind the people. So what I'm calling for is a realistic nationalism. Sure, I'm for freedom. I'm for all the same freedoms I believe that Professor Craiutu is in favor of. But I want to be realistic. Where do those freedoms come from? They come from a society in which mutual loyalty is cultivated and emphasized. That's not an organicist or a fascist society. That's a human society. And what we're looking for is human societies with boundaries that don't want to conquer the rest of the world, where the leaders will take care of their own people. Thank you.
Dr. Craiutu?
Yoram Hazony has joined the group of thinkers who believe liberalism has failed. Patrick Deneen has written an important book, Why Liberalism Failed, in which he tried to explain, much along the same lines, the failure of liberalism. But let's take a closer look at the proclaimed death or failure of liberalism. The current pessimism is somewhat surprising in light of the facts, and here are the facts, not the fake facts. Global life expectancy in the past 175 years has risen from 30 to 70. The share of people living below the threshold of extreme poverty has fallen from 80% to just 8%, and the absolute number has halved. The literacy rates are up more than 5-fold to over 80%. And civil rights and the rule of law are more robust today than they were only 4 decades ago. Now, it is important to remind that the liberal doom industry has a long and distinguished history. The death of liberalism is not a new trope, and basically, as a matter of fact, it has been announced ever since liberalism was born. About 150 years ago, the first signs of the death of liberalism were proclaimed. In an article published in February 1900, declared in England, in Edinburgh, in Scotland, declared that liberalism is dead, referring not just to the UK Liberal Party, but liberalism as a political theory. The editor of The Atlantic in 1900, across the Atlantic, the editor of The Nation, wrote despairingly of the eclipse of liberalism, and he proclaimed that liberalism is dead as well. Even after the defeat of Nazism and the victory of open society after 1945, obituaries for liberalism continued. Now, I think we have this doom industry for liberalism because the meaning of the term is ambiguous. It does not describe, and here is where I think our disagreements are probably most clear, it does not describe, in my view, a unified and coherent political theory, but liberalism serves rather as an umbrella, a rather generous umbrella for a large family of theories created over a course of several centuries by diverse authors from different backgrounds with disparate notions about the meanings and harboring different intentions. So until we see better and we discuss in further detail what liberalism is, it is hard to know what we are worrying about. The name liberalism has been used to describe systems of governance as distinctive as the French physiocrats' laissez-faire, the libertarians' night watchman state, FDR New Deal, the law-ordered state of the German ordo-liberals, or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Today, new liberals criticize neoliberalism, a catchy and imprecise word in my view, as a cause of increasing inequality and declining social mobility. At the same time, classical liberals denounce the excesses of the social welfare state for its encroachment on individual liberty and for creating state dependency. So liberalism is decried in other circles as a amoral and callous doctrine embraced by an amoral and callous elite with a blind apology of market greed and low taxes. So In my view, liberalism is a more capacious concept that all of these critics imply. At the heart of liberalism, I would like to propose one finds 4 clusters of ideas that distinguish liberals from conservatives and socialists on the right and the left-hand side of the political spectrum. Liberalism affirms, number 1, the need to accept and regulate the ethical and material conflict within society, the need to regulate this conflict in an orderly fashion. Number 2, power must be distrusted and resisted. Number 3, liberals proclaim faith in human progress and reason. And number 4, liberals profess respect for people's thoughts and individual dignity, civic respect and protection of minorities. What's interesting about liberalism as a general term is that liberals insisted on pursuing all these 4 clusters of ideas at the same time, but liberalism critics saw in this a form of incoherence. It is not, I venture to affirm, because they miss something important. Liberalism attempt to pursue all 4 ideas may be seen rather as a form of courage and strength, as a form of endurance, vigor, and yes, life. It should also remind us that liberalism is a fluid and capacious, even if not an indiscriminate story. And this is important to remind all of these ideas to the critics of liberalism today. So this is the essence of liberalism. The liberal program stands for this: toleration, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, discussion, free discussion, exchange of ideas, and debate in lieu of violence, trial by jury, publicity of proceedings, habeas corpus, opposition to arbitrary power. It is the recognition that there can be no genuine civilization without pluralism and civil liberties. It is the feeling, if you wish, for the infinite and absolute value of individual lives, one of the many values for which thinkers who lived during the age of the Enlightenment fought, people as different as Kant, Leibniz, Wilhelm von Humboldt, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Jefferson, and my favorite of all, Alexis de Tocqueville. They stood for individuality, protection against abuses of power, opposition to fanaticism of all sorts, the idea that creative power, true creative power, can prosper only in liberty, rule of law, and a system of private property. So what is really surprising for me today is to see a phenomenon described by the German economist Wilhelm Röpke, who gave a very courageous speech on February 8th, 1933, February 8th, only 8 days after Hitler came to power. He says this: rarely in history has a group of people been so busy helping to saw off the branch on which they sit. Liberal democracy has created the free and open society that most of us is taking for granted today. It has brought us a level of freedom and prosperity unparalleled in human history. So to claim that liberalism has failed, or to reject liberalism, especially in our hours of crisis, I think would be exactly to do what Röpke himself feared, to try to saw off the branch upon we all sit. And I want to remind all of you, and my distinguished colleague on the podium, that in the end liberalism neither promises nor delivers any ready-made panacea solutions to our problems. More modestly, it seeks to limit the power that is exercised in society. It creates a structure for civil discussion and civil debate, negotiations, civil standards of behavior, courtesy, compromise, and yes, a space for moderation, which is a virtue only for courageous minds.
Great, thank you. So we can now open things up to questions from the audience. As I said at the beginning, if you could come down this side, my left, your right. We have a microphone set up here at the front. If you could come there to ask your questions, that would be appreciated.
This question for Dr. Hazony. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes. Good.
Okay. So it seems that your argument for nationalism is based entirely on biblical / Hebrew text. Is that correct?
No,
No?
no.
Well, You talked about that a bit, where the idea of a nation state comes from that, correct?
Originally, yeah. Yes, originally the idea of a national state and a world order of national states is biblical. But, we have about 3,000 years of history of people arguing for it and against it since then.
So what is the modern interpretation in the modern context of the nation state to you,
What is the modern interpretation?
of a nation state, according to what you understand?
Well, a nation is a group of tribes with a shared heritage, right? Different kinds of people clustered according to their mutual loyalties with a shared heritage, usually includes a common language, often a common religion. For example, the American nation state for up until World War II was characterized by an Old Testament-oriented Protestantism as the dominant force, certainly not as the only one, but as the dominant cultural force. The common law as the legal tradition, and of course the English language. So, for example, as the United States was expanding, it added it added dozens of states, but the United States never added states that didn't have a majority that was Christian, English-speaking, common law abiding, with one exception. So that was the cultural inheritance, the things that Americans were proud of and that tied them together. And when people immigrated into the United States, they were absorbed, assimilated into that culture. It doesn't mean that they gave up every indication of, of the customs that they had left. But up until World War II, it was very clear what the American nation was, and you could say the same kind of thing about other nations. What are the basic characteristics of this nation? It doesn't mean that they can't adopt others into them, but the others who are being adopted, they have to fit themselves within the national traditions of the country. So my understanding of what it is that nationalists want in general, some of them are good guys and some of them are bad guys, but what they have in common is that they all want some kind of capacity for their own nation, to have its own borders, to control them, to have its own national inheritance, to be able to define its traditions and to choose among them and to teach them in the schools and to speak about them in public life without being saying, no, that's unfair. Why are you choosing that tradition? And to be able to pursue their own interests without having other countries saying, no, actually, it's illegitimate for a democratically elected government in Italy to pursue its own policies as it sees fit. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for being here. My question is, with the rising levels of nationalism and ethnic tension in East Asia, do you foresee nationalism leading to any sort of World War I style conflict in East Asia, or as a more unifying factor of East Asian culture to understand one another despite the differences of each country? Oh, this is to both of you, sorry.
Well, I'm not completely sure that despite what you read in the media, I'm not entirely convinced that China is a nationalist power, right? So if you're going to convince, say, with respect to India or Japan or Australia, I would have no problem saying those countries are not looking to dominate other countries. Politics involves force. I don't mean to be utopian about it. It means force and it means influence. But in general, if you take as examples of Asian powers which do not seem to me to be imperialist in their current software, Australia, India, and Japan are countries which I think you could trust them to, as far as you can trust any government and any state and any human being, but you can trust them in general to be thinking in terms of cultivating their heritage, their economies, building up their own capacities. Maybe that includes military capacities because there are threats. But I'm not sure that the tension in East Asia is because of the nationalism of those countries. I think that the principal tension in East Asia has to do with the doubt that many people have as to what China's ambitions are. And I understand there's an argument about this, but to the extent that people feel that China is attempting to replace America as kind of a world hegemon ruling the world, I think that's probably the source of most of the tensions.
Dr. Craiutu, would you?
I have nothing to add to what Dr. Hazony said.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being here today to discuss these issues. My question to Dr. Hazony is mainly addressed to the issue of America's founding. So I'm curious as to what you think, and I also have a question for Dr. Craiutu, if that's okay.
That's fine.
I'm curious as to if you think the American founding was justified. I personally, this has to do with your comment around the Boston Tea Party. I personally think that it was justified in some ways, but probably not entirely. But yeah, I guess what would you agree with the founding of our nation?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking that. Look, first of all, it's complicated. All right, let me just point out that since I'm arguing against thinking of politics entirely on the basis of consent, right? Since that's one of the central things I'm objecting to, is that we have obligations often to an inherited government or regime, traditions, religion. We have obligations, family, to things that we didn't choose. We never chose our family, and still we have obligations to our family. Since that's my view, I want to be suspicious about claims that anytime some people decides that they want to have an independent country, then they get one, right? And Professor Craiutu correctly pointed to, I think with suspicion, to independence movements. You mentioned Catalonia and Flanders, where suspiciously it just looks a little bit too much like really what you have is a wealthy region that wants to be independent because it doesn't want to share its wealth with somebody else who's poorer. All right, so no, look, I'm not taking sides on these issues. I'm saying that suspicion is in order. So I strongly support Kurdish independence. There's 30 million people there. They have their own language, a tradition going back to the Medes. They fought valiantly in many wars. They've been persecuted for centuries. And if there was something that could be done in order to help them gain independence, I would simply be in favor of it. But on the other hand, I went to Scotland, and I saw Braveheart, and I was like, yeah, Scottish independence. And did any of you see Braveheart?
Yeah.
I mean, how could you not?
Yeah.
You know, like William Wallace and all that. And I went to Scotland. I spent a couple of weeks, and I I just spoke to everybody I could, professors and restaurant owners, everybody I could about Scottish independence. And I came away with this feeling that, you know, that basically what they were saying was well, you know, Scotland should be a bit more socialist than England is, and we don't really like the English, and we saw Braveheart, and the thing that really got me is when they say Scotland would be independent, but it would be part of the European Union, right? Which to me is the same as, you know, it's saying I want to be free in jail. That's not national independence. So, you know, so I came away with the feeling of why on earth should I support the dismantling of the United Kingdom, you know, which appears to have done extraordinary things for many centuries. Why support it? So to go back to your question about the United States, it's not a simple question, but I think the best answer is like this. If the Americans were simply grumbling about their taxes being too high, then I would have no sympathy at all. But the argument was actually much more complicated, and it usually isn't taught in school descriptions of what was going on. What was actually going on was that the Americans were claiming that as Englishmen, they had traditional rights to be represented, if not in the Parliament at Westminster, then in assemblies in North America. And that the power of taxation and raising armies was, according to the English Constitution, supposed to reside in those assemblies. In other words, they were accusing the government in England of having violated the liberties of Englishmen in order to create an oppressive regime that suspended the Americans' right as Englishmen. Now that's a pretty strong argument, right? I'm not saying that necessarily I know historically that it had to end in independence, but by the time that you're saying that in England, Englishmen have one set of rights that permit them self-government, but in America they don't, then I think that you're already moving into territory where the extraordinary suffering and risk and damage that a revolution can cause might actually be justified. And I suspect, just knowing my temperament, that if I'd been there, I probably would have supported them. But that's...
Well, thank you. And then,
Yeah.
Dr. Craiutu, just very quickly, there's a line. But based on Dr. Hazony's response to that, would you say that, I see you studied in France, would you say that France should follow Macron's vision for their country, or past visions? Or do you think that the growing sentiment in the country surrounding nationalist tendencies should be carried forth in policy for the nation?
I don't have a clear answer to this question, but I would recommend you take a look at the French national soccer team. And this is a wake-up call for any French nationalist. You look at the soccer team and you don't recognize the France from 40, 50 years ago. It's a France that has a new face. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very difficult for the traditional French view of Frenchness to acknowledge the fact that this is a diverse society that basically has finally come to terms with its colonial legacy. Now, having said that, it's very important to point out that there are two faces of France. There's a Catholic face of France, which is a beautiful France, which is in decline. It's a part of France that is dying slowly, the villages, the churches, the traditional ways of life, and there's a modern part of France, modern face of France, that looks at Brussels, that sees itself as an engine of that. There's a tension at the heart of the French identity. Now, surely to be French means, of course, to know the distinctions between the 250 species of cheese, to know the difference between a good Bourgogne wine and a Bordeaux wine, never make that confusion, and to be proud of the Marseillaise. But beyond that, I think to be French is no longer an easy thing. By the way, I just want to add that to be an American has never been an easy thing. It's been always a tension at the heart of what does it mean to be an American. And for me, and I want to kind of echo what Dr. Hazony said, for me the best definition of to be an American was given by an immigrant to this country, and that was the German Karl Schurz. Karl Schurz came to America in the 1840s after the failed revolution in Germany, and he became associated with Abraham Lincoln. And in a speech he gave in, I think, 1858 or 1859 in Boston, he says, to speak of America is to speak of the last great hope of mankind. I like this visionary view, and it's not necessarily an universalist ambition, but there's a kind of, there's a humanitarian impetus behind this, but there's also something very generous. And I just want to remind you that the best image of America was given to America by France, and it is the famous Statue of Liberty in the harbor of New York. Okay? And that's a gift that was given to America by a Frenchman called Edouard Laboulaye, who was a disciple of the great Alexis de Tocqueville.
Thank you.
Mr. Mauvais.
Thank you both for excellent presentations. I had a question for Dr. Hazony regarding your criticisms of Cicero. I think in response to the second question. I guess my question is, to what extent do those criticisms apply to political philosophy as such? Do you think, insofar as political philosophy, maybe sort of the most fundamental question of political philosophy is, what is the best regime? Political philosophy aims to articulate the best form of government simply, and Cicero seems to me to be arguing in the tradition of Plato and Aristotle, and in trying to understand this. And I wanted to ask Dr. Craiutu if he could perhaps reply to those criticisms of Cicero, since he seems to be such a champion of a sort of healthy and benevolent patriotism in your view.
My task is easier. So I would like to remind the definition of what a country is, a republic, in this tradition of Republican patriotism. And I would not quote Cicero, but I would quote Rousseau. Rousseau was more explicit than Cicero in this definition, but it's the same family of spirits. It is not the walls, Rousseau wrote, nor the inhabitants which constitute the patrie, but the laws, the morals, the customs, the government, the constitution, and the way of life which results from them. The patrie consists in the relationship between the state and its members. When these relations change or dissolve, the patrie disappears. I think this is where the disagreement between our views comes to the fore most clearly, because in this tradition, which originates in Cicero, the emphasis is not, I think, on an abstract attachment to the value of the republic. It's not an universal one either. It is to the values of the republic as embodied, incarnated into some clear-cut institutions and mores, so a concrete culture and political community of the nation. So there is this tension between universalism and localism in Roman political thought, and I'm no expert on that, but I would say that this is not just republican institutions, but institutions that have been built in a particular historical context that are linked to a certain way of life, a certain way of living together, res publica, things that are common, that are shared by citizens in a particular republic. So I think that the definition that Cicero gave, and then it was reworked in the Republican tradition, is sensitive to these distinctions that I've tried to highlight.
Thanks. That's a great question about the best regime. I actually, in my book, The Virtue of Nationalism, I take this up at the beginning of part 2. The discussion in political theory is a bit skewed by the focus on Plato and Aristotle and their interest in the regime. And what I mean by that is that if you take the Bible and you try to understand what are the issues what are the political issues that interest the prophets, the biblical authors, what interests them, their concern is primarily to understand what it is that causes the formation and the disappearance of states. Right? I mean, the first half of the Bible is in fact a description of the rise and fall of a Jewish national state, and there's and along the way we get to see comments and opinions and views and theories about the rise and fall of other states that are not Jewish states, and so it's kind of striking that the question of the regime, what kind of government should you have? Well, it's definitely there. I mean, the Deuteronomic law of the king is the foundation for English political theory, going back to John of Salisbury, and it appears for centuries. The concern to find to understand the biblical political teaching with regard to things like the limitation of government, the division of powers, the rule of law, the suspicion of kingship, all of these things which liberals tend to claim as modern, they're all absolutely, totally clear in the Bible, and not only clear in the Bible, but they're clear in the medieval and early modern political tradition that preceded liberalism. It's just that we don't study those texts, so we don't know it, but it's all there. John Fortescue in 1470, you'll find the rule of law, the jury trial, the rights of property, the division of powers, the basis of human liberties on property. All of those things are in 1470. It's centuries before, it's 200 years before John Locke. It's centuries before liberalism. So part of this is just ignorance. We know Plato and Aristotle better than we know the Bible. We don't study the Bible anymore, and certainly not in university, and certainly not in political theory programs. So part of it is ignorance. Part of it is not ignorance. Part of it is that, as I said, that Scripture is interested in different questions about politics than the ones that are interesting to Plato and Aristotle. Now, I'm exaggerating grossly, and what I'm about to say is unfair, but it's only a little bit unfair. It's not a lot unfair. When you say that Western political theory is focused on the question of the best regime, basically what that means is, what you're saying is correctly, that Plato and Aristotle pay much more attention to the question of the best regime than they do to more fundamental questions of political order. So when John Stuart Mill comes and says we need to redo political theory because cohesion is crucial, what he's saying is Plato and Aristotle missed this thing without which you can't think political theory, but the Bible didn't miss it. The biblical authors are all over that. Or tribalism, the natural hierarchical structuring of all human societies, even ones that claim that everybody's equal and everybody's free. Well, you can find that, for example, all through the Bible, and it's picked up not by the usual liberal thinkers, but by Adam Ferguson, the Scottish philosopher, who does reintroduce that into political theory. So I think that what we really need is to get off of the regime fixation, which comes from Plato and Aristotle. It's important, it's crucial, but it's at most it's half the issue. To have a regime, you have to have a city or a nation or a public that is cohesive. And to have a cohesive public, you need to understand how cohesion works. That's a question not of the regime, but of political order prior to the regime.
All right, so technically we're out of time for Q&A, but these two gentlemen have been waiting for a while, so why don't we have them ask their two questions, and then maybe you can incorporate answers into your closing remarks. Does that sound good? Sure. All right, so go ahead and ask your two questions, then we'll...
Good evening. Thank you for both being here. So, Dr. Craiutu, in your critique, you discussed a little bit about the nationalism of affluence. So my question is, are you exclusively linking wealth with nationalism? In other words, can those lower on the wealth scale not participate in the cohesion that the other professor speaks of? And if yes, I'd like to receive Dr. Hazony's response, if he has one. Thank you.
Okay, great. And the next question.
Well, once again, thank you both for coming out tonight. My question is to both of you, and I'll start with Dr. Hazony. You talked about how, in order for nationalism, or in response to a question, you mentioned a common language, a common religion, at least a dominant language and religion. So my question is nationalism compatible with this rise in a multiculturalism that we've seen in America? And if it is, can the liberalism that Dr. Craiutu talked about, can that act as the cohesion for a nation that is increasingly multicultural?
No.
No.
No, it's not. It's not compatible, but it's not compatible in a way that's very different from the way that it's usually presented. All nations are internally diverse.
Okay.
All nations, the people who identify with the nation are very different. That's why I keep referring to the tribes of a different nation. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. It can be the English, it can be the French, it can be the Japanese, it can be the Russians. When you get to know any actual real nation instead of pretending, you find out that they recognize internally extraordinary diversity, right? So struggles among different cultures, different traditions and ideas within the nation, and then there's always minorities as well, right? There's also people who are to a greater or lesser degree integrated and allied with the dominant traditions, or less so, right? So every nation is diverse. Every nation is to a certain degree multicultural, as they say. The problem is that if you turn multiculturalism into an ideology, right? In other words, you say that multiculturalism is better, is more desirable than having a traditional nation in which there is a dominant heritage with multiple streams and then minor streams that are sort of allied to it. That's kind of like a classic structure of what a nation is almost everywhere. But you don't want that. What you want is to force the equalization of all traditions, of all streams, of all tribes. This is the reason multiculturalism is a descendant of Marxism, is because it is a revolutionary doctrine. What it's claiming is that it's illegitimate in a given nation for Protestants to be dominant, or for Jews to be dominant, or for Arabic speakers to be dominant, or for Russian speakers to be dominant. Multiculturalists are always looking for the smaller groups who are being oppressed by the fact that there's a majority. You know, sometimes they really are oppressed, and sometimes they're not really oppressed. But either way, if people are telling you, you know what, your tiny stream should be equal. You know, you Jews, you're 2% of the population of the United States. Your stream should be equal in every way to the Protestants who are 40% of the population. If people make that kind of argument, what they do is they create a resentment among the small groups and encourage them to go to war against the dominant groups who are the majority. Once you go to that, once you take that war far enough, you know, eventually you'll destroy the society. I mean, like, you know, there are always small power struggles, and then those are resolved one way or another for better or worse. But when we talk about multiculturalism, we're talking about an in-principle ideology that says the culture that dominated historically in the United States, that held it together and was the basis of its cohesion, its strength, and its growth, and also its contributions to mankind, that culture has to be smashed until it's just equal to every other culture that you find in the country. And I simply think it's evil it's simply a destruction for the sake of destruction.
Thank you both.
So Dr. Craiutu?
Thank you. We live in an eclectic world, a world that we need to reinvent for ourselves. And to do that, we need to be eclectic ourselves. We need to balance, I think, different ideas and make decent, reasonable compromises. And that's why I think we must engage with a wide range of worthwhile ideas drawn from different political traditions. Nationalism is one of them. Patriotism is another. Both should be included in this balancing act because for all of its ambiguity, the balancing act is dangerous after all. It reflects a range of important and valuable human needs. I spoke earlier about the need to have roots. The French philosopher Simone Weil spoke eloquently about this in her book with the same title, The Need for Roots. And I think that these needs need to be acknowledged. But the question is what kind of roots we choose. A civic form of nationalism, I agree with Yoram Hazony, offers an insufficient solution, perhaps too abstract, too legalistic. We can really not be attached to constitutionalism in general, universal rights and equal membership into a kind of a sphere of humanity. But they cover a limited, an important part, nonetheless, of human life and provide a basis for social cooperation. It seems to me that what I tried to say earlier about Alexis de Tocqueville still retains an important lesson for us today. Tocqueville came to America in 1831 and was very impressed by what he saw here. He saw patriotic citizens, not nationalist, patriotic citizens. It was a patriotism at the local level, the level of the townships, where citizens could see each other and join forces to administer their common affairs in the country. These townships are the true nation, he wrote, because they were the asylum of liberty. As I mentioned earlier, Tocqueville drew a distinction between two types of patriotism, an ancient one, perhaps the one that Dr. Hazony is attracted to, and a more modern one based on self-interest, rightly understood. This is a form that is suitable to individuals living in a modern age. As I mentioned earlier, we are individuals committed to independence. We like our privacy and our individual rights. However, we need to combine, as Benjamin Constant reminded us, a sense of independence with a sense of duties. And I think that this implies the practice of citizenship that can forge common bonds between individuals with different philosophies of life and different commitments. Love of country, as I try to define it in the Republican tradition, is perfectly consistent with self-interest slightly understood. This is a language of Republican patriotism that invites us to remain culturally and geographically defined, not citizens of the world, not cosmopolitans, interested and passionate citizens, while trying to instill in us a culture of liberty, an interest and a commitment to common good, and institutions that make possible the pursuit in common of these values. It is, again, not an invitation to a shallow form of cosmopolitanism. That's an abstract theory, an identity that none of us really can be attached to. Tocqueville's merit, I think, is precisely this one, to remind us that this civicness is a form of patriotism. And this American patriotism is not, again, patriotism based on blood or religion. It's a patriotism grounded in democratic citizenship, the rule of law, self-interest rightly understood, a sense of duty to our ancestors who made possible our republic, a sense of reverence, gratitude, and service. This type of patriotism of liberty does not need social, cultural, religious, or ethnic homogeneity. And I think on this ground we agree, both of us. Citizens cannot love a country that treats them unjustly, so there's a commitment to justice built into this. In order for us to be able to love our countries must be lovely, Edmund Burke told us. But I do think that at the end of the day, we need to be careful about embracing patriotism or nationalism too much. And I think that in order to learn how to love our countries well, we need to love them moderately. Thank you very much.
Professor Aurelian Craiutu spoke about this movement to consider liberalism, to brand liberalism dead. I wish I were part of the movement to say that liberalism were dead. Unfortunately, I'm nothing of the kind. I actually think that liberalism is alive and powerful, and at the moment continuing to dismantle the independent nations of Europe. It's being challenged, but it's not doing so badly. Let's see whether the English are capable, or the British are capable of freeing themselves from the liberal empire of the EU. We don't yet know. Liberalism is more dominant in academic institutions, in the media, in Hollywood, in virtually every ideas-producing institution in America than it was 30 years ago. So it's fighting because it has opponents. It has opponents who are fighting liberalism, but it's alive and well. My claim isn't that it's dead. My claim is that it will, in the end, kill the United States and the Europeans. And that's something very hard for me to say. It's very hard for me to imagine, but it is what's happening. Professor Craiutu responds to this somewhat doomsday-like ruminating with a kind of, I don't mean to insult you, because I actually I'm friends with Steven Pinker and I love him dearly, but there is such a thing as the Pinker response to the obvious disintegration of democracy in America and in the UK right now and in Europe. And the Pinkerite response is to begin listing statistically things that have improved since the Industrial Revolution, or since Isaac Newton, or since Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood. All of those things are true, and they're good, and conservatives like the fact that in most places, the United States is now losing in life expectancy, but in most places, things have physically, materially been getting better. That's great, but what does it have to do with liberalism? It has, I submit, nothing to do with liberalism. I described what liberalism is. It's a particular political theory. I'm not insisting that people adopt my definition, but if you're going to argue with me, then you have to at least respond to the way that I'm describing it. What I see when I speak of liberalism is the kind of political theory that I was taught in high school, and then I said in college, and then again in graduate school. It's political theories that are based on the assumption that the political world can be successfully reduced to freedom, equality, and obligations undertaken by consent. It's reductive not in the good way that it helps us to understand. It's reductive in a terrible way. It completely distorts the political reality in front of us. As long as we think that political reality consists of that kind of view, of that kind of liberal view, then we will not be able to advance cohesion of any kind of group that interests us. All right, let's take the family. The biggest problem for families in the West is that a young man and a young woman who want to stay married for the rest of their lives cannot do it. They can't do it. And I'm not saying that no one can do it, but I'm saying that in general, as a general matter, the ability to remain loyal to someone else for 50 years is an ability that has largely evaporated, is evaporating from the societies in which we live. Why? Because people aren't taught, and this goes all the way back to Aurelian Craiutu's comment earlier today about the fact that there's a Bill of Rights, but there's no Bill of Duties. Right? It comes from the fact that when we say that a family is cohesive, what we mean is that they remain loyal even when it hurts, even when it hurts terribly. You can't stay married for 15 years without it hurting. But if you're taught that actually everything is about consent and there are no obligations if you don't consent, then you wake up one morning, you look over at your wife and you say, wow, she hurts me. I'm not consenting to this, and you're gone. Not just your wife, your kids. It's not like your kids don't hurt you. Like, all your kids do is hurt you, like from the time that they're about 14, like they just hurt you, like that's their goal. And that goes on for, like 7 years. If you're lucky, they grow out of it. Right? But during that time, you can't just say, I don't consent to this. I didn't mean it when I had a kid. This isn't what I was consenting to. The only thing that holds you together is if you're loyal, if that mutual loyalty continues to hold. In order for that mutual loyalty to continue to hold, we have to speak about it. We have to discuss it. We have to understand that the family, like the nation, is built only on on that kind of mutual loyalty, and that if we are not going to teach mutual loyalty, we're not going to encourage it, inculcate it, and figure out what we can do in order to support it, then we're not going to have families that we've already taken care of pretty much, and we're not going to have nations. We're working on that too. Right, so that's what I mean by the trouble that liberalism causes. Liberalism is undermining our capacity for maintaining cohesive institutions. I hope that it can be turned around while maintaining the freedoms that both Aurelian Craiutu and I so cherish. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers for being here.
Thank you.